Hi, and welcome to our next lecture for History of Thought 2 in fall of 2020. And our large topic for today is reason, skepticism, and freedom. And there are two key readings for this topic. You are required to read the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but also Immanuel Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment? Now, for this lecture, I'm going to focus on Kant. But for the readings questions associated with this topic, question number 4 is about the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and we'll be talking about this more in class discussion. So read the U.S. Declaration of Independence and try to find connections to Enlightenment ideas. I think you'll find it pretty easy. But we'll discuss these connections as well as their context, their contradiction, that sort of thing, more in our live class. But now on to Kant. So kind of as a review from last lecture, one of the main principles of the Enlightenment is that human reason should determine our understanding of the world. And we talked a little, or I talked a little, about what exactly do we mean by reason? That this is thinking rationally about the world, it's skepticism about sort of existing traditional ways of thinking and doing things and explanations, and, basing your own views on logic, empirical evidence, and sort of a long, critical, and well thought out thought process. And it also means the application of the scientific method to understanding all aspects of life, that truth is found through the application of reason and science and not to religious faith or blind obedience to old authorities. And this isn't just reason to understand the natural world, but also the social world, also politics and government and economics and human organization. And that we should change society using reason, and we should change society for the better. But how exactly do we change society? I mean, using reason. And also, even if everybody equally is able to theoretically be reasonable and use their reason, is it the case that that's actually what exists in practice? And if not, how do we get to a society where people are thinking sort of more critically and using their reason and not relying on these sort of easy fallbacks of traditional authority or other people telling them what to do? And one of the most famous Enlightenment statements about reason and about these issues is by Immanuel Kant and his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? So a little bit of background about Kant. Kant was born in 1724 and lived until 1804. Now, he lived in the city of Königsberg in what at the time was Prussia, which would later become in 1871 part of Germany. Germany didn't exist as a country until 1871. But actually, the part of Prussia that Kant lived in is today in Russia. So it's very confusing. But he was ethnically German at the time, and he was part of the Prussian Empire. And he was one of the most prolific and important thinkers of the past 215 years, one of the greatest Enlightenment thinkers. His work touches on metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, philosophy of history, and politics. And this is actually one of the more clearly written essays writings that he has, probably because it was meant for a more general audience. So he's born in Königsberg, a powerful Prussia, which was a powerful German state at the time. Most of Prussia is now part of Germany, although, as I said, the part that he was in became part of Russia after World War II. He came from a poor and deeply religious family, and going to religious school made him very ambivalent about organized religion. He still remained sort of a spiritual person his whole life who believed in God, but he was very, very conflicted about kind of religious authorities and organized religion, which was a very kind of Enlightenment approach to religion. His brilliance, his intellectual brilliance was recognized early on. He started university at 16. And after he finished university, he couldn't find a full-time teaching job for a long time, so he worked tutoring. I guess not a lot has changed because it's really hard to find full-time teaching jobs now outside of in higher education. So then he goes back to school to get his PhD and finally secured a permanent university teaching position at Königsberg, where he was from and where he never really had left. He was an incredibly well-liked professor who pushed his students to think for themselves, which is actually very uncommon in a university setting then, in the sort of late 1700s, early 1800s. He also lived an unusually regimented, scheduled life. People used to joke in town that they could set their clocks by his schedule. At 5 a.m., he had breakfast and philosophical reflection. From 6 to 7 a.m., he prepared his lectures for the day. From 7 to 10 a.m., he taught class. Good thing we don't have 7 a.m. class anymore. From 10 a.m. to noon, he engaged in his academic writing. From noon to 4, he had lunch and usually with guests. So it's a very kind of long, leisurely lunching and intellectual conversation and that sort of thing. And then after lunch, he did his daily walk and then reading until bed at 10 p.m. And this was his life. He never, as sort of intellectually, an intellectual giant that he was, he really never left the town that he grew up in. At the age of 80, after having this long, very regimented but intellectually prolific life, he died in an accident. He didn't die of old age, in an accident when a candle caught his nightcap on fire in the middle of the night. You can imagine him like getting up in the middle of the night to do something, I don't know, get a snack, go to the bathroom, that sort of thing. And of course, this is way prior to electricity. He's holding a candle, his nightcap catches on fire. Oh well, oops, Kant. So the essay that you read for today, called What is Enlightenment, was an essay that he wrote in response to an essay competition that asked intellectuals to answer the question, what is enlightenment? So, the Enlightenment is a movement that had been going on for some time. This is sort of part of the intellectual spirit of the times. Hey, different people who have some kind of expertise should weigh in on this. So the essay question for the competition is posed by a government official. So it's a official representative of the Prussian government who's asking this question. So you can kind of think about how that would define the parameters of what people would feel comfortable saying in the essay response. And Prussia is governed by Frederick II, often called Frederick the Great at that time, who was very interested in Enlightenment ideals. He reformed the bureaucracy and the civil service in Prussia to be more efficient. He implemented some religious toleration. He opened up positions in the judicial system to people not just of noble birth, but also the middle classes. And he allowed a pretty free press for that time. But he's an absolute monarch. This is in no way a democracy. Kant actually refers to him some in the essay and his policies, so we can maybe in discussion talk some about how we think that influenced what Kant's saying. So let's talk about the essay itself. So what exactly is enlightenment, and why is it hard for individuals to achieve it, to use their own reason? As Kant says, enlightenment is dare to know. Think for yourself. Have courage to use your Have courage to use your reason. Don't be a blind follower. And mature individuals, the assumption is that all mature individuals, mature in the sense of age, right? We're not talking about children, but all adults should be capable of using their own reason. Okay, so this is a pretty simple statement, right? Think for yourself. Don't be a blind follower. So why don't people do this? Why don't people do this? Because they're afraid and because they're lazy. As I often like to say, many of these thinkers are saying we're sheeple, right? People are sheep. We're just like a big herd following wherever the one in front of us is going. So why is thinking for yourself hard? What is it? Why does this require courage? Why does it have courage to use your own reason? I mean, it's easy just to do what you're told by authorities and not think for yourself. It requires a lot of personal intellectual investment, of time, of resources, right? But so there's a lot of that, right? Other thinkers, maybe when we get to Freud, we could say by nature, look for the easy way, right? But Kant doesn't go into this as much. But also think about sort of maybe people who would be inclined to think for themselves and not follow authorities. There's often consequences for not following. I mean, if you stood up in Frederick the Great's Prussia, even with free press, and said, I don't think that there should be a king. I think we should have, a democracy. There's going to be some serious political consequences to that and to your own person. You might get beat up. You might get tortured. You might get thrown in jail. That's just what political authorities can say or can do to you. I mean, if you say something that's unpopular, you can be shunned. You can be ridiculed, right? Going with the flow is easier and safer, both intellectually and in terms of your own physical security. But what does this really mean, right? I mean, what does this really mean to say you should have courage to use your own reason? How do you actually go about doing that? And how does enlightenment actually spread through a community? How do we get more people to sort of have courage to use their own reason? And I think Kant, like other people, we'll talk about Wollstonecraft later, would say education, right? That education is key. And but this education is really connected to the fact that there are already a few individuals in a community who are able to think for themselves, like Kant probably, right? And can teach others to also think independently and to think critically. So it's about kind of this gradual spread. If you have a few people who are willing to dare to know and to sort of have courage to use their own reason, that if you're in a society where there can be some kind of free exchange of ideas, then those sort of enlightened few can help others through education to the sort of path of using your own reason. Kind of probably what Kant saw himself doing with his students. But wait, doesn't education mean following authorities? Doesn't it mean that we're all following these kind of traditional authorities, that we're not thinking for ourselves, that we're just simply we're thinking what our teachers tell us to think, or what we're learning about the subjects that the educational institutions themselves are telling us to learn about? I mean, I think Kant has a broader conception of education here. I mean, I think, something like the university clearly is an important institution, but education for him is less about learning facts than learning how to think critically. So education, yes, but in a particular kind of context with the free exchange of ideas. So it's not so much about learning certain facts, it's about learning how to think. So who should be educated? Who should have access to this education? Universal human reason applies that all have the capacity to be educated. And Kant doesn't really, his work is very general, right? This is a general essay. But, did all Enlightenment thinkers believe that everybody should have access to education? What about women? What about lower and working class men? What about people of color? We'll see Wollstonecraft and sort of her emphasis on education. And certainly some of the other thinkers of color that we'll be looking at later in the semester who are drawing upon Enlightenment ideas as well as critiquing them place enormous value in education. I mean, it's interesting when you often see people in Western cultures that are excluded from a lot of these promises of the Enlightenment. Education is normally one of the big avenues through which people gain sort of welcome into that group of being able to exercise political rights. So education isn't just about learning facts. It's also about learning how to think critically and being and daring to know, but it's also about the perception of others who are going to sort of let you into that circle of we have equality. So Kant makes a distinction between the public use of one's reason and the private use of one's reason. And this is kind of a more controversial aspect of his essay. So what is this difference that Kant is getting at? So Kant says the public use of one's reason must always be free. And this is about what we would call today probably freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the free exchange of ideas. This is intellectual freedom. As Kant says, argue as much as you like. So as member of a political community, every person or every adult person should be free, according to Kant, to publish opinions, arguments, and criticisms for public discussion and debate about political issues. But Kant says private uses of one's reason may be restricted. So what does this mean? He has this interesting example of a clergy member, right? That even if a clergy member doesn't necessarily agree with the religious doctrine, in their job as a priest or a minister, they should not be going against what their particular religious institution is, doctrine is. They should not use the pulpit and their position as a minister to preach something that's contrary to what their religious institution views. Now, if the same clergy member wanted to engage in a public debate in the newspaper or in a public square, that would be different. So what he's saying is that one should not be free to criticize or argue with one's superiors in your job as a teacher, as a military officer, as a member of the clergy, as a bureaucrat or a civil servant. In other words, we should do our jobs without complaint in order to maintain social order. For Kant, there's appropriate spaces to engage in this kind of critical thinking, and there's appropriate spaces not to. And, it's really about stability. I mean, Kant was a reformer, but today we might see him as a moderate reformer. He's supporting the freedom to publish and publicly debate, and he thinks that this freedom will gradually help people develop the tendency towards free thought and daring to know. But this is not unrestricted freedom. This is, there's still, what he would call private restrictions on the private uses of one reason. If you're a military officer, you have to follow orders. If you're a teacher, you have to follow the curriculum. If you're a civil servant, you have to follow the law. One thing we can talk about as a discussion is, what does this mean for things like whistleblowers or civil disobedience? Are there times when it becomes necessary, even in those roles, to use your own reason? I mean, do we agree or disagree with his argument? What limits, if any, should be put on our use of reason, our ability to think for ourselves, and most importantly, the spaces in which we're able to articulate and speak and debate freely? Those are fundamental discussions that we have, in U.S. constitutional law all the time. I mean, we also might kind of think about the context in which Kant is writing. He has this interesting line where he says, "Argue as much as you like and whatever you like, but obey." And again, he's praising Frederick the Great, his king at the time, who, as I mentioned, sort of engaged in a lot of reform of the government, promoting religious toleration, allowing a relatively free exchange of political ideas. But he's still an absolutist monarch. He still wants social order and social stability. So, one can always ask, does Kant fundamentally believe in this distinction between public and private reason? Or is it strategic so that he stays in good favor with political authorities? That's an interesting question. But it should be noted that the very notion that we all have equal potential to be rational and use our reason is a radical Enlightenment idea, right? And the fact that we should be skeptical, we should question authority, but it's tremendously difficult to do so. I think that's a theme that we'll see over and over again in this class, and probably resonates with us even today. See you guys next time.